I'm Alexis Palmer-Flugog, and I'm the Executive Director of the MHCCA, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kaylee Higgs, who's our project lead with the MHCCA. And I'm joining today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Please feel free to put in the chat where you're joining from today if you feel. And I'm happy to welcome Dr. Robert Selles today. Dr. Selles is a registered psychologist who specializes in the application of evidence-based treatments, those being cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance, and commitment therapy. These are used for anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorders. He serves on Anxiety Canada's Scientific Advisory Committee and on the steering and mental health committees of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, the BC chapter, also known as CAPE. Additionally, Dr. Selles is a clinical instructor at UBC and at BC Children's Hospital. Today, Dr. Selles' presentation will explore how treatment skills for anxiety disorders can be adapted to address the valid and realistic anxiety arising from the environmental crisis. If you have any questions during the knowledge exchange today, please feel free to put them in the chat. Kaylee and I and Robert will be monitoring this, and we will have time for questions at the end. If there are time-sensitive questions, though, Robert will be having a look and can answer those on the fly. So with that, I pass it over to Dr. Selles to take it away. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks. Okay, so let me share my screen here. We'll get started. Just gonna get the chat open there too, so I can see as people have questions. Okay, so as mentioned, I'm talking today about addressing anxiety resulting from the climate crisis. And so I decided that a suitable title for that might be Addressing Accurate Anxiety. And what we're going to explore is a few things. We're going to talk about what eco-anxiety and climate emotions are, think a little bit about how we might conceptualize them and conceptualize what it would mean for them to be a problem. I'm going to present the case for cognitive behavioral therapies and acceptance and commitment therapies as a potential option that could be really useful in addressing these things and look a little bit at what that might look like. At the end, we'll try to put that all together and have some time for questions and answers. So to begin, it'll be helpful to consider a basic conceptualization for anxiety and emotions, and to think a little bit about what it means when we talk about eco-anxiety. So eco-anxiety is the most commonly used word, but ultimately there's a larger host of what we would call climate emotions. And these are essentially emotional states that relate to the environment, environmental problems, and/or the climate crisis. Anxiety being a really common one, but that can also include unpleasant emotional states like worry, anger, grief, guilt, and sadness, as well as potentially positive climate emotions or things relating to the environment, such as enthusiasm and hope. In recent years, there's increasing levels of interest that are being put towards eco-anxiety and climate emotions. And evidence suggests that these emotional responses relating to the state of the environment are common. In a recent study from last year of 1,000 Canadian youth, over 56% endorsed all of those emotions. So feeling afraid, feeling sad, feeling anxious, and particularly relevant, emotions like helpless and powerlessness. In addition, it's particularly concerning to see that 37% are saying that it's negatively impacting their ability to function, and that their perceptions of the future is one that is oriented around this frightening picture of how things might turn out. So on a positive note, there's some evidence that climate emotions are related to or motivate environmental attitudes and actions, but the dynamics seem to be very complex. And a particular concern is the extent to which unpleasant climate emotions may negatively impact people's well-being, get in the way of their functioning, or lead to states of helplessness or paralysis that decrease their engagement in the types of pro-climate behaviors that are needed to address the problems we're facing. But we need to think about, what it would mean. Should we really be treating climate emotions? And I think this is a good point to share a little bit of how I've ended up in this position here talking about this. In recent years, the nonprofit mental health organization I work with, Anxiety Canada, had been getting more media inquiries about eco-anxiety. And, they wanted to publish some advice about how people could cope. So being on the committee, I got an email saying, could you support this work? And initially, I felt really overwhelmed by the request. In my experience treating people with anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorders, my work has often focused on supporting people to recognize how their anxiety is excessive and inaccurate, so that they can learn to kind of put it to the side, not give it so much attention, and gradually reduce that anxiety. And so when I thought about the climate crisis and how problematic things were, I initially felt quite confused and angry about the idea that we would be, giving the media words to placate the public's anxiety about the climate crisis. I knew that this was a significant threat, and I felt a more significant question to ask was like, why aren't more people anxious about this? But over some time and some reading and consideration of what really are the principles of the treatment approaches that I work with, I began to recognize some of the mistakes in my thinking about this problem, as well as in myself, some of the ways that I was ineffectively coping with my own climate emotions. I was anxious and overwhelmed about the state of the world, but I wasn't really doing anything about it myself. And so in the end, this topic became sort of this combination of a professional exploration, how can we support people to cope with these feelings, as well as a personal one to recognize that I have a knowledge area that might be useful, and that this understanding this further could lead to potentially some positive outcomes. So to understand how we might address an issue or whether or not climate emotions are something that we should address, it's important to start at the beginning and try to understand the basics of anxiety and emotion. So anxiety and other emotions emerge from mechanisms of survival. They're an integrated process between our minds and our bodies that allow us to identify, manage, and respond to threats so that we can protect the things that we are connected to. In this way, individuals' emotional reactions are generally stronger when something has more relevance to them. So, for example, we have an area of importance that might be our physical health and safety. It might be the people that we care about, our belonging to a specific community, and things like that. And there emerges a threat or something we identify as a threat that then creates within ourselves an emotional response, a physiological response, a mental response to analyze and understand, that then drives an urge towards a protective reaction. So emotions emerge from our connection to the things that are important to us and our understanding of potential threats to them, and then serve to help us try to protect those things. You may have come across these areas before, but essentially emotions drive certain types of automatic protective reactions. Fight, flight, freeze is kind of the common three put together. There's also evidence for fawn, and I've seen a few more Fs that people have come up with as well. But essentially, these are automatic things that our emotions urge us to do. So, they can include the drive to fight or defend our resources, to escape something that is dangerous to us, to ingratiate ourselves, or to placate or submit in order to get out of danger, or to, stay still, do nothing, and freeze in the spot. And while any of these responses can emerge from a single emotion, for example, anxiety can promote a fight response or a freeze response, in addition to the often common kind of escape response. Some emotions also drive some of these more than others. So anger really fuels that fight response. Guilt might fuel more of that fawn response, and sadness might drive more of that freeze response. Stages of grief also you can see mapped on, where that anger maps with the fight, and bargaining with the fawning sort of response, or denial with that flight response. So these protective reactions are connected to our emotions and can serve to essentially try to help us protect what's important to us. So if we apply this same model then to try to understand climate emotions, the first thing we can see is that there's an area of importance. Our environment, our world, our planet could not be described as anything other than, an area of importance to us. It is the source of our basic survival needs. It's the place in which we live. It's where we hope to feel safe. It's where we build community, where we seek to achieve our dreams for the future. And we are deeply and intimately connected to it. So in every single way, the planet connects back to individuals' level of or areas of importance for them. And as awareness of climate change and the acute impacts of climate change are building and encroaching onto individual lives, people are increasingly recognizing that it poses a substantial threat. So we have an area of importance and an identification of a threat. And that then is where these climate emotions are emerging from. People feel sad and anxious and worried because they recognize the impacts of human activity, the severity of the ongoing consequences, and the inadequacy of current actions to address the problem. And they're not indifferent to those things because they understand that they're connected to the environment, that it's important to their well-being, and because they have hopes for the future. So all of this then drives protective reactions. So that should then, we should all be already addressing the climate change, right? So what's going wrong? Well, our protective reactions emerge from basic evolutionary survival mechanisms. They're well suited to addressing specific, tangible, and easily resolvable problems, but they're not necessarily the right fit for addressing complex and uncertain threats, which really is what climate change represents. It's big, it's unclear exactly what to do, and for any one individual problem, there's not a clear, easy solution. So after all, if we come back to these protective reactions, how does one individual fight all of climate change? How does one individual successfully flee or escape it, or placate their way through it so it doesn't affect them, or outlast it? And that's what's particularly challenging and what is particularly challenging is that the stronger our emotional reaction, the more in which we feel driven to immediately engage in these protective reactions. So someone who is feeling very anxious and angry, for example, might try to fight this experience of climate by excessively reading the news. They feel like they have to know what's going on and stay on top of it. Or they might become really rigid and combative about the way things need to happen in order for things to change. That gets in the way of them being able to work with others to engage in a meaningful process. Someone might get caught ruminating a lot. They're trying to find their way out of the problem and figure out how to make sense of it so that those uncomfortable feelings will go away. Or they might just find themselves stuck in indecision, stuck just not knowing where to start, and stuck doing nothing. And in general, it's often within this context of complex, uncertain, not easily resolvable problems that mental health difficulties emerge, that people find themselves stuck in things that aren't working. And in particular, when experiences of distress continue unresolved, or the way in which those protective reactions are managing the distress actually are making things worse instead of better. For example, leading to more fear or isolating from others, or in doing things that make you ill or not well or amplify guilt, then our minds begin to interpret those emotions themselves as the problem. So this anxiety is making me uncomfortable. This uncertainty is uncomfortable. I'm leading to exhaustion, and all of that is threatening my peace, my sense of security, my ideas about the future. I can't feel this way forever. What if it's always like this? And then this initial anxiety about a really real and important threat becomes anxiety about the anxiety, and maybe sadness about that anxiety, and then guilt about that sadness, and then frustration about that guilt. And you see this amplified emotional response where things are building on each other that then drives even more of those automatic protective reactions. But now those reactions are based just on escaping the emotion itself. How do I get out of this? How do I stop these feelings from happening? And so what can happen then in this context is that people get caught up in an emotional struggle. We cannot escape our emotions. We can sometimes temporarily get rid of them or reduce them, but ultimately emotions can always come back. They are sensations that exist within our body. I've heard a great analogy. If someone, holds a gun to your head and says, "Don't feel afraid," you can't make yourself not feel afraid. And so struggling against our emotions can be a losing battle. And so people, have an emotion that's triggered. They perceive that emotion as threatening. They try to escape it, and it might work temporarily through ruminating or engaging in some behavior, avoiding things, staying in bed. But ultimately, it's temporary, and that emotion comes back. And what behavioral understandings of psychology would say is that what this can create then is this reinforcement cycle, that temporary reduction in distress where it makes you feel better for a moment uh, actually then encourages that same response the next time that emotion shows up, and that gets further ingrained into the way of handling things. And what the cognitive model also indicates is that then the way in which you perceived that emotion and the things that you thought about it is also then validated. I was only okay because I escaped it, or because I did those things. And so over time, then all of this energy is being put into the emotional struggle, and it's not being directed towards things that matter, things that work, things that help the person kind of move through the problem. So overall, what's important to think about is that we don't conceptualize emotions themselves as the problem. If someone comes with an anxiety disorder, it's not, we have to get rid of your anxiety. The anxiety itself is healthy, is natural. It is the body doing the things that it is meant to do. However, over time, when it's been managed in these certain ways, sometimes that response has become amplified in a way that it has become really unhelpful. So when we think about any emotion, but as well when we think about climate emotions, we shouldn't be concerned about reports that lots of people are experiencing emotions related to the climate, but it is worth asking, what are the outcomes of those emotions? Is the way in which those emotions are being responded to workable? Does it contribute to the things that we're hoping for? So this framework can help kind of work through that. Is this protective reaction that emerges from the emotional experience and the recognition that something is threatening something important to us, is it helping us move towards the things that we care about, our health and well-being, sustaining the environment that we depend on, contributing to a better and more hopeful future? Or is the way in which we're responding to this threat and the emotions that come after it leading to things that ultimately take us further away from those things, that get us engaged in cycles of things that are ultimately ineffective, that burn us out or lead to despair, or that sort of further create this perception that the future is hopeless and there's no point in trying. And in that case, if we see individuals who have reached that point, who are struggling with their emotions relating to the climate crisis to the point that it's unsustainable and they're really engaged in things that are not helping or are not effective, then that might be someone who would benefit from some tools and skills to help them shift how they relate to their emotions and how those emotions influence their behavior. So before I talk about CBT and ACT and why they might be useful tools, I think it's important to think about what it would mean to address climate emotions. And the most important thing I want to emphasize is that, yes, these may be unhelpful responses to climate emotions that someone is struggling with, but at the basic level, they're still emotions that are emerging from a realistic problem and one that needs to be addressed. So if any government leaders or policymakers are at this talk or see it at some point and they're wondering what to do about all these distraught young people and older people, the answer to walk away with is that the most important thing to address difficult climate emotions is to make meaningful global action that addresses the causes and impacts of the climate crisis. And that in doing so, and there's research to support this, that helps people feel like there are reasons for hope. It helps people manage the fear and anxiety and distress when they see leaders taking action, when they see the world shifting, that creates those more positive emotions that then drive change. At the same time, it is valuable to recognize that our collective ability to shift the way in which we think about the climate crisis, to shift our behavior, to use our emotions to motivate actual change is a necessary component to shift the global systems that need to shift in order for change to happen. So there is also value in this bottom-up approach that says, like, if we can help people manage their emotions more effectively as it relates to the climate crisis, get them more engaged, get them connecting with other people, get them taking action in their communities, that also then could contribute to more meaningful change. In addition, I briefly want to touch on some other things and say that CBT and ACT are not the only approaches. And to be honest, they haven't been tested much yet. So there are other things out there that are really valuable. And a lot of these works were things that I turned to when I was trying to better understand climate emotions. So my goal in discussing CBT and ACT is not to throw those away, but to instead say, like, okay, what are in total some of these psychological tools that we might have in facing these issues? At the same time, CBT and ACT do represent worthy approaches to consider because they are among the most rigorously studied and empirically supported treatments for mental health conditions. There's extensive evidence that they help reduce problematic symptoms and support overall quality of life. And in many cases, they have proven superior to other active treatment approaches. So I just have a few citations here around for anxiety disorders in particular. That's where my background is, how cognitive behavioral therapy has significant benefits that are maintained and, if anything, improve over time, and that it impacts not just symptoms, but also overall quality of life. That being said, when it comes to addressing climate emotions in particular, there's not a lot of evidence about what approaches work. And there's also some potential complications when we think about what it means for something to have worked. So, for example, we're not just thinking about reducing psychological distress in the way we might be with someone who has an anxiety disorder. We're also thinking about is is reducing their distress leading to more environmental engagement? Because that's part of our goals, is to address the climate crisis. Are they less isolated? Are they more connected? And a recent research review found that, for example, interventions that best addressed multiple needs were not necessarily the most likely to reduce individual anxiety. And sometimes there's these counter effects where, increasing people's connection to nature might make them feel increase their subjective well-being, but it also puts them more connected to this area of importance, which then could amplify their distress in other ways because they understand how nature is threatened, and that amplifies the emotional response. And for some of the people who might be really struggling with eco-anxiety and climate emotions, they might be some of the most engaged already in engaging in climate work. And so it might be realistic that in supporting them through addressing their climate emotions, there could be a reduction to their pro-environmental behavior. They're on a path that isn't sustainable and they're burning out. So as we consider how we want to address the climate crisis, it's going to be important to try to find a balance between these things that balance individual well-being as well as the social and environmental outcomes. And what that review found was that there were no CBT or ACT studies included in the review because no one had done them yet. But it did find that interventions that encouraged problem-focused action, emotion management, and social connection were the most likely to have a good overall balance. They improved kind of all the areas. So as mentioned, no one has studied acceptance and commitment therapy. One study has come out since that review that looked at internet CBT, and they did find that it reduced psychological distress without reducing pro-environmental behavior. But the way that's phrased to me suggests that it didn't also increase environmental behavior. So that's a caveat to keep in mind, is that this is still a really new area. So what I'm discussing today is not a set protocol. It's not a proven method, but I'm trying to take what I know from anxiety disorders and how much I have seen them help people get back to living lives that are consistent with prioritizing their areas of importance and conceptualize that to the climate, that they seem to be likely to have tools and skills that could help people reduce their psychological distress while also moving towards more pro-environmental action. And up until this point, I've already touched on a lot of the principles from cognitive behavioral therapy, but I'll just cover some basic principles here. The first is that cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on the interaction between thoughts, feelings, and actions. So, for example, when we feel sad, we may perceive things less optimistically, which may mean we're less likely to engage in something we would otherwise want to do, which may then further contribute to us feeling sad. That might be one example of how that cycle unfolds. Excuse me. While this sort of basic simplified model of CBT still remains widely used, over time, additional research and understanding have expanded it a little bit to include a few more constructs. So in particular, differentiating feelings a little bit between emotional states as well as sensory experiences, allows for consideration of things like somatic experiences or the way in which we interpret our senses. That, for example, excitement and anxiety are similar sensory experiences, but then the emotion represents the way in which that's interpreted, and also gives a bit more space to think about the physical body and the impact it has and the way in which our senses engage us in the world around us. In addition, there's been more of an expanded focus on the idea of the self, and the self being the part of us that is aware of these experiences, is aware of the thoughts that are in our mind, and notices the senses in our body, and recognizes or interprets the emotions that are coming up. And that sense of self, when we can help individuals manage and recognize that also represents something that's relevant to the way in which they manage and regulate their emotions. And then overall, these models also recognize that an individual does not exist in isolation, but they exist within their context, and that their surroundings, their relationships, their experiences have an impact on their internal worlds, and then vice versa, that their actions and their senses are what connect them to the world around them. And earlier, we were talking a little bit about this idea of judging something on its workability. Does something take us towards what's important to us or away? And this comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. It's an idea called the choice point. And it helps set up a framework to really look at why would we do things differently? Why would we work on any of these things? Our climate emotions are real. They reflect the significant problems that we're facing. So why would we choose to handle things differently? And it sets up a few questions, which is, what ways of responding take you away from how you want to be, drain your energy, or ultimately make things worse? And in contrast, what ways of responding would be consistent with moving towards how you want to be, your idea of living well, and or your hopes for the future? And what ACT also recognizes is that when people are managing their emotions well, or when life is going well, or when things are easy, they naturally do the towards things. People follow that path because our brains help us do that. But what happens, we don't do things that don't work on purpose. We don't intentionally set out to destroy our lives or things like that. But we encounter difficult thoughts, feelings, and experiences that then bring up those urges to engage in this emotional struggle that is ultimately effective. So what ACT then says is, okay, so all of this is happening within you. What specific experiences tend to hook you? When that thought shows up, what thought really gets you ruminating and just in your head? And what feeling do you notice gets you stuck in bed and unable to kind of do the things that you need to do in your day? And in contrast, it also sets up the exploration of like, what does it look like when you unhook? So even if someone is really stuck as it relates to the climate, they can probably think of an example in their life where they have a difficult thought or feeling show up and they don't automatically respond to it. For example, maybe they really like chocolate chip cookies, and when they see one, they really want one, but they're able to think like, no, I've had enough sweets. I'm not going to have that. And they want it, and the thought is there, but they're able to sort of separate themselves from it and make a choice that's more consistent with what they want to do. And so that's what ACT then looks to build, and sort of build skills for people that help them make those choices that are more consistent with moving towards who they want to be. So with those frameworks in mind, I'll just walk through some of the skills from CBT and ACT that might be useful in supporting individuals struggling with the emotional burden of the climate crisis. So both typically start with psychoeducation, which is essentially helping people understand some of the things that I've laid out today. That our emotions are natural, healthy responses, that our emotions themselves are not the enemy, and to help people understand the ways in which they are connected to the ways they think and feel and act and so forth. And those are often good opportunities to help people feel less broken, so to speak, or less, and to help validate the fact that what they're experiencing makes sense. But beyond that, then CBT focuses on four main principles: building awareness. Often people might engage in tracking, looking at, when this thought shows up, how do I feel? And then how do I behave? And when I behave that way, how does it make me feel? And how do I think? So they start to understand how this process unfolds for them. They may engage in restructuring tasks, which look at how can I adjust my thinking to reflect reality and to help me cope. They might engage in coping tools and strategies. So how can I effectively manage my feelings in ways that are healthier or that work better? And often CBT also then thinks about exposure experiments, this idea of, what happens when instead of running away from distress, I face it and make sort of those choices to try something out anyways. So I'll walk through them in a bit more detail. In cognitive restructuring for an anxiety disorder, some of the distortions that are coming up might be inaccurate assessments of a threat, like that dog is dangerous or failing the test is the end of the world. And while that would not really be what you're targeting in response to the climate crisis, because the threat is real and it's significant and the evidence supports that, there may still be a number of distorted perceptions that contribute to more distress and more avoidant or unhelpful behaviors. So, for example, some common distortions that CBT identifies is things like the mental filter. And it might be something where someone's like, nothing good is happening in the world. Everything is bad. And their mind is really sort of zoomed in on all of those negative things, which contributes to that sense of hopelessness and then drives inaction. They may have an all or nothing perception. Like, if we don't keep the world to 1.5, there's no point in trying. Or if I don't recycle this perfectly, I'm the problem. And both of those things, right, might amplify the distress and then inhibit them from acting effectively. Labeling reflects to sort of things that we might say to ourselves that are critical, that again kind of decrease our motivation to act effectively. I'm a failure. I'm a loser. I'm not good at anything. And some of those might relate to the climate, and some of them might just be general self-perceptions that emerge from the emotional struggle. Overgeneralization is this idea that like one thing becomes everything. So, I went to that climate protest yesterday and it didn't do anything, so it will never make a difference. Might be an example of overgeneralization. Jumping to conclusions would be assuming the outcome without sort of actually testing it out. If I talk to my friends about my climate concerns, people will think I'm a drag. Might be an example of a conclusion. Or thoughts, emotional reasoning kind of reflects feelings as facts. So I feel hopeless, so it is hopeless, might be an example. So what cognitive restructuring might look like with some of these things is asking some deeper questions. Is that actually true? Could we test that out? Even if it were true, does it change what you would want for the world or the things that you would hope to be true? When that thought shows up, does it make you more or less motivated to do the things that are helpful? What could be another way of thinking about it? And so our goal through cognitive restructuring wouldn't be to deny reality or, I've often heard people say like, oh, you're just trying to gaslight my anxiety away. That's not the intention. Instead, it's to find a balanced thought that is more helpful in actually responding to the anxiety, that gets us closer to effective solutions. So along with that, then CBT might help build coping. It might recognize that if we can't regulate our emotions effectively, if our emotions are really, really intense and strong, then we're not going to be able to think things through or choose effective solutions. So there might be some focus on, let me see if I can zoom in on this. Just doing those basic things that take care of our well-being. developing a creative outlet that helps us process emotions, prioritizing our sleep enough, making sure that we're eating well, sort of these holistic, broad solutions and things like that. Um, and in addition, CBT often focuses on problem solving. So, okay, there are some realistic things that you're struggling with and you don't know how to handle. Your mind is telling you run away or ignore. Let's look at what other options there might be and try to work through that process and see if we could test out a different option and see if it works better. For acceptance and commitment therapy, it emerges from CBT. So a lot of what I've already talked about would be potentially part of a CBT approach. What acceptance and commitment therapy does really well, sort of above and beyond CBT, is that it creates a lot more room for people who might be ambivalent. They might, for example, kind of feel like their emotions are really important and they need to pay attention to them. And so they don't want to reduce them or deal with them differently. Or people who are so kind of connected to their emotional experience that they don't feel like they have any control. I can't do anything differently. It's automatic. And so ACT sometimes provides a really nice framework and set of additional skills that can help build this flexibility and to sort of see things from a different perspective. So these are what are called like the 6 core strategies in ACT. And they map pretty closely onto that sense of the psychological map that I talked about earlier. And just to explain them briefly, values focuses on helping people figure out what's important to them, who they want to be, how they would want to live their life. Self as context is that idea of building people's awareness of themselves as the noticer and helping them learn to understand that they can guide their attention, that they can choose what they focus on and what they pay attention to. Diffusion is the process of, instead of being caught up in our thinking, stepping back from our thinking, being able to recognize I'm having a thought that there's no point, rather than just assuming that there's no point because that's what your mind is telling you. Acceptance relates to the idea that engaging with the world meaningfully is going to involve experiencing uncomfortable feelings. So how do we make room for those feelings? How do we open up to them and say, like, I'm willing to feel anxious about the climate because doing something about it is important to me. Being present focuses on some skills that help us, instead of being lost and struggling against those emotions, bring our attention back to where we are right here, right now, the way in which we can engage with the moment, the way in which we can engage with our body, so that ultimately we can choose to do things that work, that we can take action that actually fulfills what's important to us. So what might that look like in practice? If we think about what people are experiencing as they're trying to move through the world, they're trying to move to the futures that they hope for, and to make things better, and they're facing a reality that is painful. Things are not the way that they should be. Uh, Things are bad. And the automatic response to that pain has been taking them away. It has not been helping them lead the life that they feel like consistent with how they want to be or the future that they want. So these tools might be used to help them slow down and take a step back, to recognize that what they're doing isn't working, and that it's time to kind of take a new approach. It might be used to help set up the idea of responding to themselves in a way that is kind and a way that's willing to experience uncomfortable feelings and to be ready for that process. It might be used to help them choose to face reality, to say, like, this is bad, it is out of my control, there are things that are challenging here, and to help them allow for process and sit with some of those uncomfortable feelings. But ACT is also not about wallowing in our discomfort and being like, I'm anxious and sad and woe is me, and I have to just sit here thinking about all the time how terrible the climate crisis is. It's also about moving through that pain. So finding ways to bring oneself back to the moment, to connect with other people, to cope through those difficult experiences, to figure out, I'm feeling this way because it's important to me, because I care about it, because I want to be someone who, protects the environment or who protects my family and my health. And then using that to gently bring attention back to what's important, to catch and sort of redirect from those thoughts like there's no point, nothing's working, and to use it to then fuel those actions that would be more consistent, that would be potentially effective. And this isn't like, oh, you do this one time and then it's working. This is ongoing skills that you would be using throughout the day. And in practice, applying ACT is something that looks like lots of exercises and experiential things. It looks like, practicing sitting and noticing thoughts and feelings and identifying them. And it looks like, thinking about 1 year from now, even regardless of how things turned out, if I look back and I feel like I handled things really well, what would I have done? How would I have treated myself? How would I have treated other people? What actions would I have taken? Right? That's identifying those values. So there's lots of ways to work on these things, but this hopefully provides you a summary of if someone had these skills, how they might use them to try to interrupt this pattern of responding ineffectively and get towards a pattern where they're honoring their feelings and why they're feeling them, and then using them to engage with the world in ways that are more helpful and meaningful. And just to sort of summarize and connect the title, you can see here that these are the two parts of the process, right? So there's this process of acceptance, that things are difficult, and being willing to make that recognition. And then a second step, which is to commit to doing things about that work, that are consistent with how you would want to handle it. So just to put that all together, we've discussed that in conceptualizing climate emotions, they reflect people's connection to things that are important and a recognition of the threat, as well as this drive to protect that thing. And then we've discussed that in managing emotions, there's this need to balance acceptance and openness to those emotions, and then to commit to finding effective solutions. And, coming back to those ideas of reducing people's distress might not be sort of the outcomes then that are most consistent with our overall picture. If we're working with people struggling with climate emotions, we're looking then to find a balance between these things. We can't force them into more connection with climate issues if that is a detriment to their ability to protect themselves. And at the same time, it's not just sitting with all of these uncomfortable feelings if it doesn't involve actually sort of moving forward towards doing something about it. So, and thinking again about those strategies that have been proven helpful from other approaches, moving towards then might involve driving some of that engagement in managing my emotions more effectively, engaging in problem-oriented action, and connecting with other people. So in summary, it might sound something like, yeah, that acceptance and protection is the earth is our home and source of life. Our current relationship with it is not sustainable. The scale of the threat is immense, and this reality is emotionally painful. Our emotions reflect what is important to us. Coping with our emotions intentionally instead of reactively can help us find sustainable and value-consistent actions to address the problem. We do not have to carry this burden alone or do everything ourselves. Honoring our unique skills and calls to actions and connecting with others who care, we can work together to implement meaningful action. And we engage with life in ways that are consistent with moving towards our hope, and we sustain that by recognizing we cannot act effectively if we neglect our emotional well-being. All right.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Dr. Selles. That was a really great talk, and I think really laid out paths that we can take to help alleviate some of this anxiety and move it towards action. We now have time to answer some questions. Maybe raise your hand and we can answer questions as they arise. I know that we received some questions via email. Kaylee, did you want to start with those?
Sure, yeah, maybe I'll drop those in the chat if that's okay. I'll just pull them up here and maybe we could start with either of those if you want, or if anyone has any they want to add. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. So there's two questions we received in advance. One about how psychological first aid can actually worsen anxiety or concerns around that. And then another one about reconciling the urgency of the crisis while also needing to move at the speed of trust. So I dropped those both in the chat if you want to try
Yeah,
tackling either of those.
for
And then if anyone
sure.
else has ones
So
they want to add.
sounds good. Yeah, the CISD or psychological first aid was this idea that if someone has a traumatic experience, that you would like go in and process it with them. And it has been shown to actually have some counterproductive effects. And essentially, if again we think about emotional processes, a little bit of denial or sort of putting things out of mind right after something really intense and distressing has happened is self-protective. And so what that tried to do is sort of insert and say, like, we got to work through this, otherwise it's going to be a problem. But it's jumping ahead of the problem understanding, right? And it's saying that in that moment, a little bit of time to like process and understand things and put things out of mind so that people can focus on addressing like the actual things that they need to address in their life is a healthy response. And it's down the road when time has passed and things they haven't been able to move on that you might say, okay, this person needs some support to address this thing. So I think if we think about this, my talk wasn't really aimed at like jumping in to help people right after a climate crisis. It was more about people who were overwhelmed in general. But I think that the same message applies, which is we don't want to pathologize natural emotional responses. Like people are going to struggle to figure out how best to address the emotions that are coming up with the climate crisis, and they might choose a few ineffective ways at first, but it's in particular when people get really stuck on that emotional struggle that often things emerge into more problematic patterns that we want to try to help them address. And with the second question, I think it's a interesting one in that it also overlaps with something I'm feeling in general, which is I'm happy to be talking about how we could help the people who are the most overwhelmed and try to help them act more effectively. But there's also a whole nother talk here, which is like, how do we get all the people who are somewhat concerned, like who kind of know it's an issue, but just aren't engaging with their emotions, to like actually care and find a way. And I don't, they're not gonna be the ones signing up to receive CBT or ACT. They're not the ones who are seeking out supports for these things because they're dealing with it primarily by just kind of re-engaging in the status quo and these other things. And hopefully someone else as part of the group maybe will have some ideas about that. But it is challenging. I think as clinicians or as researchers or as people working in this field, we also have to employ the choice point to ourselves. And we have to think, okay, I can't control how many people are going to care about the climate crisis. I can't guarantee that I can like effectively get everyone to do more so that things change. All I can do is try to live by the principles that I think are important, to put in an energy that is sustainable for myself, to try to foster people towards things that would be better. And if we get caught on this all or nothing thing where it's like, it's so urgent, we have to do everything right now, it is urgent. But if we're really stuck on that idea, is it helping us be more effective, or is it reducing our energy? Is it making us feel like giving up, like there's no point, or like trying to force things onto people when people aren't ready for it? And that's a really tough balance. And I think it's just trying to find that space, that level of engagement where we're actually able to work, and then putting some hope and faith in things like, tipping points and these things that, like, as we build energy and more people get involved, people also start to buy in, and that then unfolds more quickly as things change.
Great. Thanks very much. It's definitely given us all a lot to think about. Do we have any more questions from the audience? No. And I love the idea of how action can make people feel more engaged and more connected. It's always amazing how good something like a beach cleanup or going to a protest or having a community event can make you feel more connected and feel really good about these sorts of things. Okay, we have a question here from Anna. Your thoughts on climate cafes?
Yeah, I don't know the research on how effective they are, but they sound to me like a really great idea. If we think back to those three outcomes that the review study suggested, we want to sort of support. It's a place in which people socially connect. They have a space to talk through the emotions that are arising in response to the climate change, and to try to think about how they would want to manage those emotions. And in a lot of ways, right, I think it's really nicely aimed at people who are maybe in that middle ground. Like, the emotions are coming up, they're not quite sure how to handle them, and they want to try to do something about it. My guess is you put someone in there who's like extremely emotionally distraught, they're going to have a hard time engaging, or they could derail. And so some of the strategies I'm talking about, are probably a bit intensive, and something like the Climate Cafe would be the perfect setting for kind of a lot of the general public, whereas what I've been discussing might be more focused on kind of that smaller portion of people who are really overwhelmed and having a hard time.
Great. Thanks very much.
And Kaylee, do you mind sharing what your comment reflects?
Oh, sorry. I was just thinking about some of the things you were sharing about the distorted perspectives and things like that. Honestly, the thing that was coming to mind is how the media talks about climate. I find a lot in terms of sense of hopelessness. Or I know there's been some research too around how the fossil fuel industry is kind of pushing narratives of doomism as well, because then it prompts people to disengage. So, yeah, just what you're saying about ways to engage people or support that climate community. It wasn't really a question. It was more just me rambling in the chat. So.
I just wanted to understand it, but yeah, I think you're totally right. Like, these distortions come from emotions, but they also come from messaging, right? Our context and like what we've been told, both in terms of that there's no hope because that's what the fossil fuel industry wants us to think, or things like emotions are bad is taught to us often when people are like, calm down, or like, you don't need to feel that worried, right? We're taught in some ways that our emotions are threatening. Yeah, fear is definitely a big part. What strategies might be a focus for recognizing this? That is, a lot of where that psychoeducation, the beginning to understand, your emotions, and taking that step back and looking at, when that fear shows up, and then you go, oh no, I'm anxious again. Now it's like, it's never going to get better, and this is overwhelming. What happens then? Well, then I try to make myself feel better, but it doesn't work. And then I'm doing this. So you're setting them up to sort of understand how that is taking them away, and how maybe being willing to feel those feelings or practicing having those feelings could help them move towards those things that they want to do.
Thanks very much. And I see we're at time. Thanks everybody for the great questions. And thanks, Dr. Sellers, for your time today. I just want to let everybody know that the Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance also has a list of resources for people who are looking for some help. Yeah, you can always reach out to us via our website. As well, we have our Mental Health and Climate Change Summit coming up in February, where we'll be talking a lot about this this topic, as well as different ways to address climate anxiety, like arts-based methods and mindfulness. So please do join our newsletter or join our social media channels and keep up with all of the work that we're doing. So once again, thanks, Dr. Sellers, for your time, and thanks everybody for joining. Have a great weekend, everyone.